On the first day of September in the year 1939, Nazi Germany launched a full-scale invasion of Poland. The attack marked the beginning of a new phase of the war in Europe. Within a few weeks, the Polish state was defeated, and large parts of the country were placed under German occupation. The occupation authorities immediately began to reshape Polish society through repression, arrests, and violence from the earliest days of occupation. German security forces targeted those considered dangerous to the new order. Polish political leaders, intellectuals, teachers, priests, former military officers, civil servants, and members of resistance organizations were arrested in large numbers. The goal was to eliminate potential opposition and break the social structure of the occupied population. Arrests were often carried out without formal charges or trials. Existing prisons in occupied Poland quickly became overcrowded. Cells designed for small numbers of inmates were filled far beyond capacity. Detention facilities could no longer contain the growing number of prisoners. German authorities began searching for alternative solutions to isolate and control large groups of detainees. In early 1940, the leadership of the Schutzstaffel decided to establish a new large concentration camp on occupied Polish territory. The Schutzstaffel already operated camps within Germany, but the situation in occupied Poland required additional facilities. The new camp was intended to hold political prisoners, intimidate the local population, and serve as a tool of repression. Overall authority over the concentration camp system was held by Reichsfuhrer Schutzstaffel, Heinrich Himmler. He played a central role in expanding and organizing the camp network. Decisions regarding new camps, command appointments, and operational priorities required his approval. Under his direction, the concentration camp system became increasingly centralized and standardized. Administrative, financial, and logistical matters were handled by the main administrative and economic office of the Schutzstaffel. This office controlled construction projects, budgets, food supplies, uniforms, and equipment. It also oversaw the use of prisoner labor for state and private purposes. Through this structure, camps were integrated into the broader economic and security system of Nazi Germany. The town selected for the new camp was Auschwitz, located in southern Poland. The location offered several strategic advantages. Auschwitz lay at an important railway junction connecting multiple regions of occupied Europe. This made it suitable for transporting prisoners from distant areas. On the outskirts of the town stood a complex of former Austro-Hungarian army barracks. These buildings had been constructed at the end of the 19th century. After the First World War, they were used only partially and remained structurally sound. The existing infrastructure allowed for rapid conversion into a detention facility. The surrounding region was sparsely populated. This reduced the risk of public attention and made secrecy easier to maintain. The natural isolation of the area supported the goals of the camp administration. These factors combined to make Auschwitz an ideal location for a concentration camp. On the 27th day of April in the year 1940, the decision to create the Auschwitz concentration camp was formally approved. This date marked the official establishment of the camp. Shortly afterward, preparations began to adapt the barracks and secure the area. Rudolf Höss was appointed as the first commandant of Auschwitz. He was an officer of the Schutzstaffel with previous experience at the Dachau concentration camp. Höss was known for strict discipline and loyalty to the organization. Under his command, Auschwitz was organized according to existing concentration camp models. From the very beginning, the camp relied on violence and intimidation. Rules were enforced through beatings, punishments, and executions. The purpose was to break prisoners psychologically and establish absolute control. Human dignity was deliberately destroyed as part of this process. On the 22nd day of May in the year 1940, the first group of prisoners arrived at Auschwitz. This group consisted of 30 German criminal prisoners, transferred from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. They were not ordinary detainees. They were assigned positions of authority within the prisoner population. These men became prisoner functionaries, serving as barracks supervisors and enforcers of discipline. They acted under the direction of the camp guards. Their role was to control other prisoners through violence and fear. This system allowed the camp administration to maintain order while minimizing direct involvement. On the 14th day of June in the year 1940, the first large transport of Polish political prisoners arrived at Auschwitz. The transport came from the prison in Tarnow. This date is widely regarded as the beginning of Auschwitz as an operational concentration camp. From this point onward, prisoner transports increased steadily. Upon arrival, prisoners underwent a standardized intake procedure. They were ordered to line up and surrender all personal belongings. Items such as documents, money, jewelry, and personal objects were confiscated. These possessions were never returned. Prisoners were then shaved and disinfected. Their hair was removed to eliminate individuality and prevent lice, although hygiene remained poor. They were issued striped camp uniforms and wooden shoes or worn footwear. Their names were replaced with identification numbers. Registration marked a crucial step in the dehumanization process. Prisoners ceased to exist as individuals in the eyes of the camp administration. They were reduced to numbers recorded in camp files. From this moment, personal identity had no official meaning. During the first months, Auschwitz functioned primarily as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor inside and outside the camp. Tasks included construction, maintenance, and manual labor under harsh conditions. Work assignments were physically exhausting and deliberately punishing. Deaths occurred frequently. Prisoners died from beatings, malnutrition, disease, exhaustion, and executions. Medical care was minimal and often denied. The weak and ill were regarded as useless. Daily life was dominated by fear and uncertainty. Roll calls were held early in the morning and again in the evening. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours while guards counted them. Weather conditions had no influence on the duration of roll calls. Any perceived violation of camp rules could result in severe punishment. Punishments included beatings, confinement, and execution. Punitive measures were often carried out publicly to deter resistance. Fear was used as a primary tool of control. Although Auschwitz was not initially designed as a center for mass extermination, its function began to change rapidly. The number of prisoners increased beyond initial expectations. The authority of the Schutzstaffel expanded steadily. Nazi policies became increasingly radical during the course of the war. Plans were made to enlarge the camp and extend its role. New sections were envisioned. Additional land was requisitioned. The infrastructure was prepared for expansion. By the end of the first year of its existence, Auschwitz had moved beyond its original purpose. It was no longer merely a site of detention and intimidation. Preparations were underway for a far more extensive system involving mass imprisonment, forced labor, and killing. The foundations of one of the largest camp complexes in history had been laid. The transformation of Auschwitz was not sudden. It developed step by step through administrative decisions and operational changes. Each stage built upon the previous one. What began as a regional concentration camp was being reshaped into a central instrument of Nazi policy. This marked the beginning of Auschwitz as a place that would soon play a decisive role in the history of the war and the crimes committed during it. In the year 1941, the Auschwitz concentration camp entered a decisive phase of expansion and transformation. This change was directly linked to developments on the eastern front of the war. The scope of repression widened, and the function of the camp began to shift beyond its original purpose. On the 22nd day of June in the year 1941, Nazi Germany launched a large-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. The operation resulted in rapid territorial advances during the first months. As German forces moved eastward, vast numbers of Soviet soldiers were captured. Within a short period of time, hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war were taken into German custody. The German authorities were unprepared to manage such a large captive population. Existing prisoner of war camps were insufficient. Food supplies, shelter, and medical resources were limited. As a result, mortality among Soviet prisoners of war across occupied territories was extremely high. Beginning in the summer of 1941, the first transports of Soviet prisoners of war were sent to Auschwitz. These prisoners were treated differently from other detainees. They were not granted protections under international conventions. Instead, they were regarded as expendable enemies. Soviet prisoners of war were housed in separate sections of the camp. Many were kept outdoors without proper shelter. Barracks were incomplete or overcrowded. Food rations were minimal and irregular. Clean water was scarce. Medical assistance was almost entirely absent. The physical condition of these prisoners deteriorated rapidly. Starvation weakened their bodies. Exposure to harsh weather caused illness. Infectious diseases spread quickly among the overcrowded groups. Guards subjected prisoners to frequent beatings and abuse. Mortality among Soviet prisoners of war in Auschwitz was catastrophic. Thousands died within weeks of arrival. Deaths were caused by hunger, exhaustion, disease, and violence. The camp administration made no effort to prevent these deaths. The loss of life was considered acceptable and even desirable. At the same time, The leadership of the Schutzstaffel began searching for more efficient methods of killing large numbers of people. Mass shootings had been widely used in occupied territories. However, these methods were considered slow and psychologically burdensome for personnel. They also required significant logistical coordination. As a result, alternative killing methods were explored. Attention turned toward chemical substances that could be used in enclosed spaces. One such substance was Zyklon B. This chemical had previously been used for pest control and disinfection. In late summer of 1941, Zyklon B was tested within the Auschwitz camp complex. The experiments were carried out under controlled conditions. They involved prisoners who had already been marked for death. The objective was to determine effectiveness, speed, and reliability. In September of the year 1941, the first mass killing using Zyklon B took place in Auschwitz. The location was the basement of Block 11. The victims were Soviet prisoners of war and Polish political prisoners. The operation was supervised by Camp Commandant Rudolf Host and members of the camp medical staff. The results of the experiment met the expectations of the camp authorities. Zyklon B proved capable of killing large groups of people within minutes. The method required fewer personnel than mass shootings. It also allowed for greater secrecy and control. This moment marked a turning point in the history of Auschwitz. Killing was no longer an improvised act of violence. It became a planned and repeatable process. Murder was transformed into a technical operation. Following these experiments, the leadership of the Schutzstaffel approved the broader use of Zyklon B. Facilities were adapted for this purpose. Procedures were developed and refined. The groundwork for systematic extermination was established. At the same time, plans were made to expand the physical size of the camp. The existing facilities at Auschwitz were no longer sufficient. A new site was selected near the village of Brzezinka, located a short distance from the original camp. This location offered space for large-scale construction. Construction of the new camp began in the autumn of 1941. The site became known as Auschwitz-Birkenau. The project was carried out primarily using prisoner labor. Conditions during construction were extremely harsh. Prisoners were forced to work long hours in mud and cold. They lacked proper clothing and footwear. Food rations were inadequate. Beatings were common. Many prisoners died during the construction phase. Auschwitz-Birkenau was designed with mass operations in mind. The layout included long rows of barracks intended to hold thousands of prisoners. Large open areas were reserved for selection procedures. Railway infrastructure was planned to allow direct access into the camp. Railway lines were extended toward Birkenau. This allowed trains to deliver prisoners directly to unloading platforms inside the camp perimeter. Long marches from distant stations were eliminated. This reduced public visibility and increased efficiency. The design of Birkenau reflected a new purpose. It was not intended solely for detention or forced labor. It was built to process large numbers of people quickly. Selection, killing, and disposal were integrated into the camp structure. While Birkenau was under construction, conditions in the original Auschwitz camp continued to deteriorate. Prisoner numbers increased steadily. Food rations were reduced. Forced labor intensified. Selections became more frequent. Prisoners who appeared weak, ill, or exhausted were removed from work details. These prisoners were often killed by shooting or chemical means. Survival depended increasingly on physical strength and chance. The atmosphere inside the camp grew more brutal. Violence became routine. Executions were carried out publicly. Fear dominated daily life. By the end of the year 1941, Auschwitz had undergone a fundamental transformation. It was no longer only a concentration camp for political prisoners. It was become an essential site for systematic killing. The expansion of Birkenau signaled a new stage in the operation of the camp complex. The developments of 1941 laid the foundation for what followed. Administrative decisions, technical experiments, and construction projects combined to reshape Auschwitz. The camp was being prepared for a role that would soon place it at the center of one of the largest crimes in modern history. This phase marked the transition from repression to organized mass murder. The mechanisms were in place. The infrastructure was expanding. The direction of the camp was now irreversible. In the year 1942, the function of the Auschwitz camp complex changed irreversibly. What had previously been a system of repression, imprisonment, and selective killing was transformed into a mechanism designed for continuous mass extermination. This transformation was the result of political decisions taken at the highest levels of the Nazi state and implemented through administrative coordination, transportation networks, and camp infrastructure. On the 20th day of January in the year 1942, a meeting of senior officials of the Nazi government and security apparatus took place in the Berlin district of Wannsee. The purpose of this meeting was to coordinate the implementation of a policy aimed at the complete destruction of the Jewish population of Europe. Responsibilities were assigned to various ministries, police authorities, and administrative offices. The process of mass murder was organized as a bureaucratic operation. Following this meeting, deportations to killing centers were intensified and standardized. Auschwitz was designated as one of the central locations for this operation. Its geographic position, railway connections, and expanding infrastructure made it suitable for large-scale deportations from across Europe. Beginning in early 1942, transports to Auschwitz increased rapidly. Jewish communities were targeted in occupied Poland, where ghettos had been established earlier in the war. People were removed from their homes, assembled at collection points, and prepared for deportation. These actions were carried out by police forces with assistance from local authorities. Soon, deportations expanded beyond occupied Poland. Transports arrived from Slovakia, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. Later in the year, deportations included Jewish populations from Greece and Italy. The operation extended across much of Europe and involved multiple national railway systems. Victims were informed that they were being relocated for labor in the East. They were instructed to bring personal belongings, clothing, food, and documents. Families were often told that resettlement would be permanent. This deception reduced resistance and facilitated orderly transport. Transportation to Auschwitz was carried out primarily in freight wagons. These wagons were not designed for human transport. Each wagon was filled far beyond capacity. There was no seating. There was no sanitation. Ventilation was minimal or non-existent. Journeys lasted from several days to more than a week. During transport, prisoners received little or no food and water. Extreme overcrowding caused suffocation and panic. Children, elderly people, and the sick were especially vulnerable. Many died before reaching their destination. When trains arrived at Auschwitz to Birkenau, they stopped at unloading platforms located inside or near the camp perimeter. Prisoners were forced out of the wagons by guards shouting orders and using violence. The dead were removed from the wagons and separated from the living immediately after arrival. A selection process took place. Officers of the Schutzstaffel evaluated each individual within seconds. The decision was based on appearance, age, and perceived physical ability. No medical examination was conducted. Those deemed capable of labor were separated and temporarily spared. Children, elderly individuals, people with disabilities, the sick, and most women with children were sent in a different direction. For the majority of those selected away from labor, this decision meant immediate death. The selection process was conducted efficiently and without explanation. Families were separated permanently. Many victims did not understand what was happening. They believed they were being directed to showers or registration facilities. Those selected for killing were led toward buildings described as bathing or disinfection stations. They were ordered to undress and leave their clothing in designated areas. Belongings were carefully collected and sorted. Prisoners were told they would receive food and employment afterward. Once the chambers were filled, the doors were sealed. Zyklon B was introduced into the enclosed space through openings in the structure. The chemical released toxic gas upon exposure to air. Death followed within minutes after the killing process was complete. Special prisoner units known as Sonderkommando were forced to enter the chambers. These prisoners were assigned to handle the bodies of the dead. Their tasks included removing corpses, cutting hair, extracting gold teeth, and transporting bodies for disposal. Bodies were burned in crematoria constructed for this purpose. When crematoria capacity was exceeded, bodies were burned in open-air pits. Ashes were scattered in nearby fields, rivers, and ponds. All efforts were made to eliminate physical evidence of mass murder. Those selected for labor were registered as prisoners. Their heads were shaved. Identification numbers were assigned. Personal names lost all official meaning. Prisoners were issued camp uniforms and assigned to barracks. Living conditions for registered prisoners were harsh and degrading. Barracks were overcrowded. Food rations were inadequate. Sanitation was minimal. Disease spread rapidly. Forced labor became the central element of survival. Prisoners were assigned to work details based on perceived physical strength. Those who weakened over time were subject to new selections. Selection was not a single event, but a recurring process. Throughout the year 1942, deportations continued without interruption. Trains arrived daily. The killing facilities operated continuously. The system was designed to function day and night. The scale of murder increased steadily. Auschwitz became capable of killing thousands of people each day. The process was organized, repetitive, and impersonal. Individual lives were reduced to numbers and categories. By the end of the year 1942, Auschwitz functioned as a fully operational extermination center. Its role within the Nazi camp system was firmly established. The combination of deportation, selection, killing, and forced labor formed a single integrated mechanism. The transformation of Auschwitz was not the result of a single decision. It developed through a sequence of administrative actions, technical adaptations, and logistical planning. Each step expanded the capacity for mass murder. This period marked the moment when Auschwitz became the central symbol of systematic extermination. The camp no longer served only regional or political purposes. It became a primary instrument for the implementation of a continent-wide policy of destruction. The events of 1940 to define the future operation of the camp. From this point onward, mass murder was no longer exceptional. It was routine. By the beginning of the year 1942, the Auschwitz camp complex had become an essential component of the German war economy. In addition to its role in mass killing, the camp was increasingly used as a reservoir of forced labor. Prisoners were viewed not as human beings, but as a temporary and replaceable workforce. The objective was to extract the maximum possible labor output before physical collapse or death. The system of forced labor was centrally organized and tightly controlled. Decisions regarding labor deployment were made by the main administrative and economic office of the Schutzstaffel. This office coordinated construction projects, industrial contracts, and the distribution of prisoners to work sites. Economic exploitation was fully integrated into the concentration camp system. German state institutions and private companies benefited directly from prisoner labor. Agreements were established between the Schutzstaffel and industrial firms. Companies paid fees for the use of prisoners, while the camp administration retained full control over discipline and punishment. Prisoners received no wages and had no rights. One of the largest and most significant industrial projects associated with Auschwitz was the construction of a chemical industrial complex near the camp. This project was led by the German conglomerate IG Farben. The company planned to produce synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel, both of which were critical for the German war effort. The location near Auschwitz was chosen specifically because of the availability of forced labor. To supply workers for this project, a separate camp was established. It became known as Auschwitz III Monowitz. The camp began operating in the year 1942. Prisoners assigned to Monowitz were selected during regular selections in Auschwitz and Birkenau. Those who appeared physically strong were sent to the new camp. Conditions in Monowitz were extremely harsh. The camp was located several kilometers from the main Auschwitz site. Prisoners were forced to march to work sites daily or were housed directly near construction areas. The workday often lasted 12 hours or longer. Prisoners performed heavy manual labor under constant supervision. They carried construction materials, dug trenches, poured concrete, assembled industrial structures, and operated machinery without training. Protective equipment was rarely provided. Accidents were common and often fatal. Injured prisoners were not treated adequately. Medical care was minimal and focused primarily on returning prisoners to work. Those who could not continue working were labeled unfit. They were removed during selections and transported back to Birkenau, where they were killed. Food rations provided to labor prisoners were completely insufficient. Daily meals consisted of watery soup, a small portion of bread, and occasional substitutes. The caloric intake was far below what was required for sustained physical labor. As a result, prisoners lost weight rapidly and became increasingly weak. Exhaustion became one of the primary causes of death among forced laborers. Many prisoners collapsed at work sites and were beaten or left unattended. Some died where they fell. Others were transported back to the camp and later selected for death. Forced labor was not limited to Monowitz. Throughout the Auschwitz complex, prisoners were assigned to a wide range of work details. These included construction inside the camp, maintenance of barracks and fences, agricultural labor on nearby farms, road building, railway repair, warehouse work, and administrative support tasks. A network of subcamps was established across the surrounding region. Each subcamp was connected to a specific industrial or agricultural operation. All subcamps were subordinate to the central Auschwitz administration. Conditions varied slightly, but brutality and exploitation were universal. Discipline within the labor system was enforced through violence. Guards used beatings, whippings, suspension by the arms, confinement in punishment cells, and executions. Punishments were often carried out publicly in front of other prisoners. The purpose was to instill fear and maintain control. Prisoner functionaries played a key role in enforcing labor discipline. These individuals were selected by the camp administration and granted limited privileges. They supervised work details, reported infractions, and often used violence to maintain their positions. This system encouraged internal conflict and reduced solidarity among prisoners. Selections were an integral part of the labor system. Camp doctors and guards regularly inspected prisoners at work sites and in barracks. Those who appeared weak, ill, injured, or exhausted were removed. Selection could occur without warning and at any time. Prisoners selected as unfit for labor were transported to Auschwitz to Birkenau. In most cases, they were killed shortly after arrival. This process ensured a continuous cycle of exploitation followed by elimination. New transports replaced those who had been worked to death. The labor system operated with ruthless efficiency. Prisoners were reduced to tools within an economic machine. Their value was measured only by their ability to work. Once that ability was lost, their lives were considered expendable. By the year 1943, forced labor had become fully institutionalized within the Auschwitz camp complex. The camp served a primary function simultaneously. One function was the systematic extermination of entire populations. The other was the economic exploitation of prisoners for the benefit of the German war economy. These two functions were not separate. They were interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Forced labor weakened prisoners physically and mentally. Those who survived labor were eventually selected for death. The integration of economic exploitation into the camp system demonstrated the extent to which mass murder and profit were linked. Industry benefited from unpaid labor. The Schutzstaffel benefited financially and administratively. Prisoners bore the full cost with their lives. By the end of this phase, Auschwitz had become not only a site of killing, but also a central hub of forced labor on an unprecedented scale. The camp complex stood as a symbol of systematic exploitation, where human beings were consumed by both violence and economic demand. By the year 1942, medical activity inside the Auschwitz camp complex had become an integral part of the system of control, exploitation, and killing. Medicine, which in normal circumstances exists to preserve life, was transformed into an instrument of violence. Camp doctors operated within a structure that rejected medical ethics and replaced them with ideological obedience and administrative efficiency. Doctors assigned to Auschwitz were formally trained physicians. They held academic degrees and professional qualifications. They were members of the Schutzstaffel and functioned as officers within the camp hierarchy. Their authority extended over selections, treatment decisions, and life and death judgments. Medical personnel played a central role in the operation of the camp. They conducted health inspections during selections on arrival platforms. With brief visual assessments, they decided who would be sent to forced labor and who would be sent directly to death. These decisions were final and could not be appealed. In addition to selections, camp doctors supervised medical blocks within the camp. These blocks were presented as infirmaries. In reality, they often served as places of neglect, experimentation, and preparation for death. Only prisoners who were temporarily useful or considered valuable for experiments received any form of treatment. One of the most notorious figures among the camp doctors was Joseph Mengele. He arrived at Auschwitz in the year 1943. He was assigned primarily to Auschwitz to Birkenau. Mengele became known for his frequent presence at the arrival platforms. During selections, Joseph Mengele showed particular interest in twins, children, and individuals with physical differences. When such individuals appeared during deportations, they were separated from their families immediately. Parents were often deceived and told that their children would receive special care. In reality, separation meant the beginning of medical experiments. Twins were housed in special barracks. They were measured, photographed, and documented in detail. Experiments were designed to compare physical responses between siblings. Procedures included repeated blood draws, injections of chemical substances, and exposure to infectious diseases. Many procedures were performed without anesthesia. Children experienced extreme pain and fear. Some experiments involved deliberate injury or surgical intervention. Deaths during experiments were common. When one twin died, the other was often killed shortly afterward. This allowed doctors to compare internal organs during autopsy. Bodies were dissected, and organs were preserved for research purposes. The scientific value of these procedures was negligible. Another doctor involved in medical crimes at Auschwitz was Karl Klauberg. He specialized in gynecology and conducted experiments focused on mass sterilization. His work was carried out primarily on Jewish and Romani women. The objective was to develop methods for rapid and inexpensive sterilization of large populations. Klauberg injected chemical substances directly into reproductive organs. These procedures caused severe pain, inflammation, infection, and long-term damage. Many women suffered permanent infertility. Some died from complications. Women subjected to these experiments were often unable to walk afterward. Medical care was inadequate or non-existent. Those who became too weak were removed from the medical block. In many cases, removal meant death. Sterilization experiments were also conducted on male prisoners. Some involved exposure to radiation directed at reproductive organs. Victims experienced burns, internal injuries, and severe long-term health effects. Many died from infections or organ failure. Camp doctors also conducted experiments involving infectious diseases. Prisoners were deliberately infected with illnesses such as typhus and tuberculosis. Doctors observed the progression of disease under controlled conditions. Treatment was frequently withheld to document symptoms and outcomes. Vaccines and treatments were sometimes tested. However, experimental groups were often denied care entirely. Control groups were allowed to die untreated. Mortality rates among experimental subjects were extremely high. Other experiments focused on physical endurance and trauma. Prisoners were subjected to extreme conditions. Some were exposed to freezing temperatures. Others were deprived of food or water for extended periods. Medical experiments were closely linked to the system of selections. Prisoners who appeared weak, ill, or physically unusual were often sent to medical blocks rather than directly to gas chambers. For many, this only delayed death. Experimentation replaced immediate killing. The medical system operated with full support from camp administration. Doctors reported to higher authorities within the Schutzstaffel. Records were kept, reports were written, and results were shared. Despite this bureaucratic structure, the experiments lacked ethical justification. Medical records were often detailed and precise. Measurements, observations, and outcomes were recorded carefully. However, many records were destroyed during the evacuation of the camp. This makes it difficult to determine exact numbers of victims. What remains clear is the scale of suffering. Thousands of prisoners were subjected to medical experiments. Children, women, men, and elderly individuals were used as test subjects. Survival was rare. Medical authority was used to legitimize cruelty. The presence of doctors created an illusion of scientific purpose. In reality, medicine was subordinated to ideology and control. Healing was replaced by harm. Doctors who participated in these crimes did not act alone. They were supported by nurses, orderlies, guards, and administrators. The medical system functioned as part of the larger camp machinery. Responsibility was shared across multiple levels. The impact of these experiments extended beyond physical injury. Survivors carried psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. Many suffered chronic pain, disability, and infertility. Families were permanently destroyed by the year 1944. Medical experimentation had become routine within Auschwitz. The practice continued until the final months before evacuation. As the front approached, some experiments were accelerated. Others were abruptly terminated. During the evacuation of the camp, many medical records were burned. Doctors attempted to destroy evidence of their actions. Some fled and attempted to conceal their identities. Others were captured after the war. The medical crimes committed at Auschwitz represent one of the most severe violations of medical ethics in history. They demonstrate how professional knowledge can be corrupted under totalitarian systems. Doctors became agents of destruction rather than care. The legacy of these crimes influenced post-war medical ethics. International standards were later developed to prevent similar abuses. These standards were shaped in part by testimony from survivors. The medical experiments at Auschwitz were not isolated incidents. They were part of an organized system supported by ideology and authority. They illustrate how science can be misused when detached from humanity. This chapter marks a critical dimension of the Auschwitz system. Medical personnel were not observers. They were active participants. Their actions contributed directly to suffering, death, and the destruction of countless lives. Daily life inside the Auschwitz camp complex was shaped by absolute control, constant violence, and deliberate deprivation. Every hour of a prisoner's existence was regulated by rules designed to dominate the body and break the will. The camp functioned as a closed world in which fear, hunger, and exhaustion defined reality. Each day began long before sunrise. Prisoners were awakened abruptly by shouting, whistles, and blows from guards or prisoner functionaries. There was no gradual transition from sleep to activity. Anyone who failed to rise immediately risked punishment. The sick, the weak, and the injured were given no special consideration. Prisoners were forced to leave the barracks quickly and assemble outside. Clothing was thin and often torn. Footwear was inadequate, especially during winter months. Cold, rain, snow, and heat were irrelevant to the camp schedule. Morning roll call was a central element of daily routine. Prisoners were lined up in formation and required to stand motionless. Roll calls often lasted several hours. If a prisoner had died during the night, the body was brought outside and placed among the living for counting. If the numbers did not match camp records, the roll call continued until the discrepancy was resolved. Roll calls served multiple purposes. They allowed guards to maintain control and enforce discipline. They exhausted prisoners physically before the workday began. They also functioned as a form of psychological punishment. Barracks were overcrowded and unsanitary. Wooden buildings originally intended for far fewer occupants housed hundreds of prisoners. Sleeping arrangements consisted of multi-level bunks. Each bunk level was shared by several people. Mattresses were often absent. Straw, when provided, was infested with insects. Space was extremely limited. Prisoners slept pressed against one another. Movement during the night was difficult or impossible. The lack of rest contributed to constant fatigue. Sanitation conditions were catastrophic. Washing facilities were limited and frequently broken. Clean water was scarce. Soap was rarely available. Prisoners were unable to maintain basic hygiene. Toilets consisted of open latrines. Access was restricted to specific times. During roll calls or work hours, prisoners were not permitted to leave their positions. Violations were punished severely. These conditions led to the rapid spread of disease. Lice infestations were constant. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other infectious illnesses spread quickly. Medical care for ordinary prisoners was minimal or non-existent. Prisoners who became ill were often ignored. Those who could not work were considered useless. Many were selected for death rather than treated. Illness became a direct pathway to extermination. Food distribution was strictly controlled. Rations were deliberately insufficient. Breakfast usually consisted of a liquid substitute resembling coffee. Lunch was typically a thin soup made from water and vegetable scraps. Dinner included a small portion of bread, sometimes accompanied by margarine or a substitute spread. The caloric content of these meals was far below what was required for survival. Prisoners performing heavy labor burned far more energy than they consumed. As a result, weight loss was rapid and severe. Hunger dominated daily thought. Prisoners spoke constantly about food. Dreams of meals and memories of home cooking were common. Starvation weakened the body and eroded concentration. After roll call, prisoners were marched to work assignments. Work details varied depending on camp needs. Assignments included construction, road building, agricultural labor, warehouse work, cleaning, and industrial tasks. Marches to work sites were conducted under guard. Work was physically exhausting and relentless. Prisoners were expected to maintain a fast pace regardless of condition. Any slowdown was met with beatings. Guards and prisoner functionaries enforced productivity through violence. Safety measures were virtually non-existent. Tools were inadequate. Protective equipment was not provided. Accidents occurred frequently and were often fatal. Prisoners who collapsed at work sites were beaten or left behind. Some died where they fell. Others were transported back to the camp and later selected for death. Compassion was absent from the system. The internal hierarchy of the camp played a significant role in daily life. Certain prisoners were appointed to positions of authority. These included barrack supervisors, work detail leaders, clerks, and block elders. These prisoner functionaries were granted limited privileges. Privileges included slightly better food, improved sleeping positions, or reduced physical labor. In exchange, functionaries were expected to enforce discipline. Many abused their power to maintain status and survival. Violence between prisoners was encouraged by the system. This reduced the need for direct intervention by guards. It also created divisions and mistrust within the prisoner population. Punishments were an ever-present threat. Even minor infractions could result in severe consequences. Punishments included beatings, whippings, suspension by the arms, confinement in punishment cells, and execution. Punishments were often carried out publicly. Prisoners were forced to watch others suffer. This reinforced fear and obedience. The goal was total submission. Selections were a constant reality. Camp doctors and guards conducted inspections regularly. Prisoners were examined briefly and arbitrarily. Those who appeared weak, ill, injured, or exhausted were removed. Selections could occur in barracks, at work sites, or after roll call. There was no warning. Removal usually meant transport to Auschwitz to Birkenau. For most, this meant death. Prisoners lived with constant anxiety about selection. Every cough, limp, or moment of weakness carried risk. Survival depended on appearing strong, even when strength was gone. Despite these conditions, prisoners sought ways to survive. Some formed small support networks. Food was shared secretly when possible. Information was exchanged quietly. Skills could increase chances of survival. Prisoners with technical abilities, language skills, or administrative experience sometimes obtained less physically demanding work. However, such positions offered no guarantee of safety. Chance played a major role. The behavior of guards, the timing of selections, and random events often determined survival. No strategy ensured protection. Psychological endurance was as important as physical strength. Many prisoners struggled to maintain a sense of identity. Memories of family, religion, and pre-war life provided some inner resistance. Others survived by focusing on routine and immediate tasks. Thinking beyond the present moment was often unbearable. Hope was fragile and easily destroyed by the year 1943. Daily life in Auschwitz had become a continuous cycle of exhaustion, hunger, fear, and loss. New transports arrived constantly. Deaths occurred daily. The camp operated without pause. Life inside Auschwitz was stripped of normal measures of time and purpose. Days blended together. The future was uncertain. Survival meant enduring one day at a time. The system was designed to destroy both body and spirit. Yet within this environment, prisoners continued to exist, resist internally, and bear witness. Their daily struggle formed the human reality of the camp beyond statistics and structures. This daily existence was not accidental. It was carefully constructed. Every element served the larger purpose of control, exploitation, and extermination. Resistance inside the Auschwitz camp complex existed under conditions deliberately designed to make resistance nearly impossible. The camp system was built on isolation, terror, hunger, exhaustion, and constant surveillance. Every element of daily life was structured to destroy solidarity and prevent organized opposition. Despite this, prisoners resisted in ways that were quiet, fragmented, and extraordinarily dangerous. From the earliest months of the camp's operation, prisoners sought ways to retain a sense of agency. Resistance often began with small acts that preserved human dignity. Sharing food, helping the sick, warning others of selections, and refusing to abandon fellow prisoners were all forms of defiance. These actions carried serious risks, as even minor rule violations could result in punishment or death. Organized resistance developed primarily among political prisoners. Polish political detainees played a central role in forming the first underground networks. Many of them had experience in pre-war political organizations, trade unions, or military structures. They brought discipline, secrecy, and organizational methods into the camp environment. Underground groups were structured in small cells. Members often knew only one or two other participants. This system limited the damage if someone was captured or tortured. Secrecy was essential for survival. Communication inside the camp was extremely difficult. Guards monitored prisoner movement closely. Contact between different barracks and work details was restricted. Despite this, prisoners developed methods to exchange information. Messages were passed quietly during work assignments. Information was memorized rather than written whenever possible. When written notes were used, they were hidden carefully or destroyed immediately after reading. Languages and coded phrases were used to conceal meaning. One of the primary goals of the underground resistance was to inform the outside world about what was happening inside Auschwitz. Prisoners understood that survival alone was not enough. They believed that testimony was essential to expose the crimes being committed. Documentation became an act of resistance. Prisoners collected information about deportations, selections, killings, and living conditions. They recorded numbers of transports, countries of origin, and approximate victim counts. Descriptions of gas chambers, crematoria, and killing procedures were compiled from eyewitness accounts. This information was assembled at great personal risk. Reports were smuggled out of the camp through various means. Civilian workers employed near the camp carried messages beyond the perimeter. Some prisoners released or transferred to other camps carried information with them. Escapees also played a crucial role in transmitting testimony. Several prisoners succeeded in escaping from Auschwitz. Escapes required careful planning, cooperation, and often assistance from outside the camp. Prisoners obtained civilian clothing, forged documents, or memorized routes. Escape attempts were extremely dangerous. Captured escapees were usually tortured and executed publicly. Collective punishment was imposed on remaining prisoners. Entire barracks could be punished after an escape. Food rations could be reduced. Prisoners could be beaten or killed in retaliation. Despite these measures, hundreds of escape attempts were made during the camp's operation. Some prisoners succeeded in reaching resistance organizations outside the camp. Their testimony provided some of the earliest reliable reports about mass extermination. Although these reports were not always believed immediately, they later proved accurate. Sabotage was another important form of resistance. Prisoners assigned to workshops, factories, warehouses, and construction sites attempted to disrupt operations. Tools were damaged, materials were wasted, production errors were introduced deliberately in industrial work sites. Prisoners slowed production whenever possible. In construction projects, measurements were altered. In workshops, finished parts were rendered unusable. These actions were often small and difficult to detect. Sabotage carried extreme risks. Discovery could result in torture, execution, or collective punishment. Despite this, prisoners continued to resist through these methods. Sabotage represented refusal to cooperate fully with the system of exploitation. Resistance also took psychological and cultural forms. Prisoners attempted to preserve identity and memory. Some prayed silently. Others recited poetry, songs, or religious texts from memory. These acts helped prisoners maintain a sense of self. Education became a form of resistance. Prisoners secretly taught one another languages, mathematics, history, and science. Lessons were brief and conducted during moments of relative safety. Education preserved intellect in an environment designed to erase it. Storytelling also served as resistance. Prisoners shared memories of their lives before the camp. They spoke of families, professions, and traditions. These conversations affirmed that life existed beyond the barbed wire. One of the most dangerous forms of resistance occurred within the Sonderkommando units. These prisoners were forced to work directly in gas chambers and crematoria. They removed bodies, extracted valuables, and disposed of the dead. They witnessed mass murder on a daily basis. Members of the Sonderkommando were isolated from other prisoners. They were given slightly better food and conditions to keep them physically capable. However, they were fully aware that their own lives were temporary. The camp administration regularly executed Sonderkommando units to eliminate witnesses. Knowing that survival was unlikely, members of the Sonderkommando decided to resist. They began organizing secretly despite constant surveillance. Contacts were established with the underground resistance inside the camp. The objective was not escape, but defiance and destruction. Female prisoners played a crucial role in preparing resistance. Women working in munitions factories near the camp had access to explosives. Over many months, they smuggled small quantities of gunpowder into the camp. Each act of smuggling risked immediate execution. The smuggled explosives were hidden and gradually accumulated. Plans were made in complete secrecy. Participants understood that discovery would result in death. Despite this, preparations continued. On the 7th day of October in the year 1944, the Sonderkommando uprising took place at Auschwitz to Birkenau. Prisoners detonated explosives inside one of the crematoria. The building was severely damaged. Guards were attacked with improvised weapons. Several guards were killed or wounded during the uprising. Some prisoners attempted to escape during the chaos. Others continued fighting despite overwhelming odds. The uprising was suppressed by armed units of the Schutzstaffel. Most participants were killed during the fighting or executed shortly afterward. Those captured alive were tortured and publicly executed. The crematorium that was damaged never returned to full operation. The uprising left a permanent mark on the camp. Although the uprising did not halt the extermination process, its significance was profound. It demonstrated that resistance was possible even in the most controlled environment. It destroyed part of the killing infrastructure. It preserved proof of defiance. After the uprising, repression intensified throughout the camp. Searches became more frequent. Interrogations grew more brutal. Members of the underground were hunted down and executed despite increased repression. Resistance did not disappear. Prisoners continued to document events when possible. They continued to help one another survive. They continued to preserve information about crimes. As the war situation worsened for Nazi Germany, conditions inside Auschwitz began to change. Prisoners heard rumors of advancing front lines. Some guards appeared increasingly nervous. Evacuation preparations became visible. Hope and fear existed simultaneously. Prisoners understood that evacuation could mean death marches rather than freedom. Uncertainty dominated the final months. By the end of the year 1944, organized resistance inside Auschwitz remained limited but persistent. It could not change the overall fate of the camp. However, it ensured that evidence, testimony, and memory survived. Resistance in Auschwitz was not measured by success or victory. It was measured by refusal to surrender completely. Each act of defiance challenged the system's claim to total control. Each act affirmed human agency under extreme oppression. The history of resistance inside Auschwitz reveals the complexity of survival. It shows that even when physical resistance was nearly impossible, moral resistance endured. These acts form an essential part of the camp's history. Auschwitz was a place of destruction. It was also a place where individuals chose to resist, to record, and to bear witness. Their actions ensured that the crimes committed there could not be erased. By the end of the year 1944, the military situation of Nazi Germany had changed fundamentally. The Red Army was advancing steadily from the east. German forces were retreating across occupied territories. The front line was moving closer to southern Poland with each passing week. The Auschwitz camp complex, which for years had functioned as a central site of imprisonment, forced labor, and extermination, now stood in the path of advancing Soviet forces. The leadership of the Schutzstaffel understood that the liberation of the camp would expose the full scale of the crimes committed there. Orders were issued to prepare for evacuation. The primary objectives of evacuation were clearly defined. Prisoners were not to be liberated. Those who could still be used for labor were to be transported westward, into German-controlled territory. Those who could not march were to be abandoned or eliminated. Evidence of mass murder was to be destroyed as thoroughly as possible. During the final months of 1944, preparations for evacuation intensified throughout the Auschwitz camp complex. Administrative offices began destroying documents. Transport lists, registration records, medical files, and execution reports were burned. Efforts were made to erase traces of extermination. Gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz to Birkenau were systematically dismantled or destroyed. Explosives were used to damage structures. Cremation pits were covered or abandoned. Ash disposal sites were disturbed in an attempt to conceal evidence. Despite these efforts, complete destruction of evidence proved impossible. The scale of the camp was too large. The volume of victims was too great. Structures, belongings, and human remains could not be fully erased. Prisoners became increasingly aware that evacuation was approaching. Rumors circulated through barracks and work details. Some believed evacuation meant transfer to other camps. Others feared mass execution. Anxiety and uncertainty dominated daily life. As winter deepened, conditions worsened. Food rations were reduced further. Work demands remained high. Illness and exhaustion spread rapidly among the prisoner population. On the 17th day of January in the year 1945, the evacuation of Auschwitz officially began. Approximately 60,000 prisoners were ordered to leave the camp complex. They were assembled rapidly under armed guard. No preparation time was provided. Prisoners were organized into long columns. They were ordered to march westward toward camps located deeper inside German territory. These forced evacuations became known as death marches. The name reflected both the conditions of the marches and their consequences. Prisoners were given little or no food before departure. No additional clothing was distributed. Many wore thin striped uniforms and wooden shoes. Temperatures were extremely low. Snow and ice-covered roads and fields. The marches were conducted under constant threat of violence. Columns were guarded by armed members of the Schutzstaffel. Guards were ordered to prevent escape at all costs. Anyone who fell behind was beaten. Those unable to continue walking were shot immediately. The pace of the marches was relentless. Prisoners already weakened by years of starvation and forced labor struggled to remain upright. Many collapsed within the first hours. Bodies were left behind along roads and in fields. The marches lasted for days and, in many cases, weeks. Routes led toward camps such as Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen. Distances varied, but physical demands were extreme. There were no rest periods. Food during the marches was almost non-existent. Some prisoners received a small piece of bread after several days. Water was scarce. Snow was sometimes eaten to relieve thirst. Dehydration and hunger accelerated physical collapse. Prisoners marched through towns and villages. Local civilians witnessed columns of emaciated men and women guarded by armed escorts. Reactions varied widely. Some civilians secretly attempted to provide food or water. Others remained silent or turned away. Guards responded harshly to any civilian interaction. Prisoners who attempted to receive assistance were beaten or shot. Civilians who intervened risked arrest or punishment. Fear governed both prisoners and bystanders as the marches continued. The roads became littered with bodies. Those who collapsed were often executed on the spot. In some cases, bodies were buried hastily. In many cases, they remained unburied, exposed to the elements. Escape attempts occurred despite the risks. Some prisoners attempted to flee into forests or fields during moments of confusion. A small number succeeded, often with the help of civilians. Many were captured and executed. Discipline among guards varied as the marches progressed. Some guards carried out orders with extreme brutality. Others became increasingly erratic as defeat approached. In isolated cases, guards abandoned their posts and fled. Prisoners who survived the marches and reached other camps encountered further suffering. Receiving camps were overcrowded. Food shortages were severe. Disease spread rapidly. Many prisoners died shortly after arrival due to exhaustion and illness. Not all prisoners were evacuated from Auschwitz. Approximately 7,000 prisoners remained behind. These were primarily individuals who were too ill, weak, or injured to march. Camp authorities abandoned them without supplies or supervision. The abandoned prisoners faced catastrophic conditions. Food supplies were almost non-existent. Medical care was extremely limited. Barracks were damaged and unheated. Many prisoners lay among the dead and dying. Despite these conditions, some prisoners attempted to care for one another. Those who could still move shared food when possible. Basic hygiene was attempted using limited water. Survival depended on cooperation, chance, and endurance. As evacuation progressed, Auschwitz became increasingly empty. Guard towers were abandoned. Barbed wire fences stood damaged or unguarded. Administrative buildings were left behind with evidence still inside. The machinery that had operated for years began to collapse. Killing operations ceased. Forced labor ended. The camp complex was reduced to ruins, survivors, and traces of mass murder. By late January of the year 1945, Soviet forces were approaching rapidly. Gunfire could be heard in the distance. The sound of artillery reached the camp area. Liberation was imminent for the prisoners who remained. The final days were filled with fear and uncertainty. They did not know whether guards would return. They did not know whether they would be executed before liberation. Hope existed, but it was fragile and uncertain. On the 27th day of January in the year 1945, Soviet soldiers entered the Auschwitz camp complex. They encountered abandoned facilities, destroyed structures, and thousands of prisoners in critical condition. The scale of the crime was immediately evident. The evacuation of Auschwitz represented the final stage of its operation under Nazi control. Although systematic killing had ceased, death continued through starvation, exposure, and violence. The death marches claimed tens of thousands of lives. These marches extended the reach of Auschwitz beyond its fences. They carried suffering across roads, villages, and countryside. Prisoners died far from gas chambers, but as a direct result of the same policies. The evacuation failed in its primary objective. Despite efforts to destroy evidence, Auschwitz remained. Survivors, structures, and material traces testified to what had occurred. The death marches stand as one of the final crimes committed by the camp system. They demonstrated that even in defeat, control and destruction remained priorities. Human life was never considered. By the time the last columns disappeared into the West, Auschwitz had ceased to function as a camp. What remained was silence, ruins, and survivors waiting for help. The evacuation did not erase the history of Auschwitz. It extended its violence into the final days of the war. It ensured that suffering continued until the very last moment. This chapter marks the collapse of the Auschwitz system. The next stage would confront the world with evidence, testimony, and the full reality of what had been created and destroyed there. By the final days of January in the year 1945, the Auschwitz camp complex stood largely abandoned by its administrators. The evacuations had removed most prisoners and guards. What remained was a landscape of destruction, ruins, and thousands of survivors who were too weak or ill to march. Silence replaced the constant noise of orders, machinery, and transport. On the 27th day of January in the year 1945, units of the Red Army reached the area of Auschwitz. Soldiers approached cautiously, unaware of the full nature of the site they were entering. They encountered abandoned guard towers, damaged barbed wire fences, and empty administrative buildings. There was no organized resistance. As Soviet soldiers entered the camp complex, they discovered approximately 7,000 prisoners still alive. Most were severely malnourished. Many were ill, injured, or dying. Some were children. Many had been hiding among corpses or lying on wooden bunks without strength to move. The survivors were in critical condition. Starvation had reduced bodies to skeletal forms. Frostbite was common. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other diseases were widespread. Medical assistance was urgently required. Soviet medical units and field hospitals were brought into the camp area. Doctors and nurses began providing emergency care. Food was distributed carefully in small portions to avoid causing harm to weakened bodies. Medical staff worked under extreme conditions, despite immediate assistance. Many prisoners died in the days following liberation. Their bodies could not recover from years of starvation and abuse. Liberation did not guarantee survival. Death continued even after the guards were gone. As soldiers and medical personnel moved through the camp, they began to understand the scale of what had occurred. Barracks were filled with human remains. Corpses lay unburied in open areas. Piles of ashes and bone fragments were visible near destroyed crematoria. Warehouses inside the camp contained enormous quantities of personal belongings. Clothing, shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, and household items filled storage buildings. Children's shoes were stacked in piles. Women's hair was found packed into sacks. These items represented individuals who had passed through the camp and had not survived. The volume of belongings indicated the scale of deportations and killings. Each object testified to a life that had been taken. Soviet investigators began documenting the site almost immediately. Photographs were taken. Structures were examined. Survivors were interviewed. The camp was preserved as evidence of crimes. Investigators discovered the remains of gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Although many structures had been destroyed, their purpose was clear. Blueprints, equipment remnants, and survivor testimony confirmed their function. The technical organization of mass killing became evident. Documents that had not been destroyed during evacuation were collected. Registration files, transport lists, and administrative records were recovered. These materials provided insight into the operation of the camp system. They revealed the bureaucratic nature of mass murder. Survivors were questioned about their experiences. Many were too weak to speak. Others gave detailed testimony despite physical exhaustion. Their accounts described deportations, selections, forced labor, medical experiments, and killings. Children who survived were found wandering alone. Many had lost their families during selection upon arrival. Some had survived by hiding or being protected by other prisoners. Their presence illustrated the indiscriminate nature of the camp system. Local civilians from surrounding areas began entering the camp after liberation. Some provided assistance. Others observed in silence. The presence of survivors and remains forced confrontation with realities that had been ignored or concealed. News of the liberation of Auschwitz spread rapidly. Reports reached Moscow and other Allied capitals. Photographs and eyewitness accounts began circulating. The name Auschwitz entered public awareness. However, full understanding of the camp's function did not occur immediately. The scale of the crime was difficult to comprehend. Many outside observers struggled to believe the details reported by survivors and investigators. Disbelief persisted despite evidence. Survivors were gradually evacuated from the camp. Those able to travel were transferred to hospitals and recovery centers. Children were placed in care facilities. Many survivors searched for relatives, often without success. For most survivors, liberation marked the beginning of another struggle. Physical recovery was slow. Psychological trauma was profound. Many had no homes to return to. As the war continued elsewhere, Auschwitz became a site of investigation rather than operation. Soviet authorities secured the area. The camp was preserved for documentation and future legal proceedings. The focus shifted from survival to testimony. In the months following liberation, international journalists, military officials, and investigators visited Auschwitz. They documented the camp and interviewed survivors. Their reports contributed to growing awareness of the Holocaust. Auschwitz became a central symbol of Nazi crimes. It represented the organized nature of mass murder. It demonstrated how modern bureaucracy, technology, An ideology combined to produce destruction on an unprecedented scale. The evidence found at Auschwitz challenged existing conceptions of warfare and crime. This was not random violence. It was systematic, planned, and administered. Killing had been transformed into a routine process. As investigations continued, responsibility began to be assigned. Camp commandants, guards, doctors, and administrators were identified. Survivor testimony played a crucial role in establishing individual and institutional guilt. The liberation of Auschwitz also forced moral confrontation. Questions arose about knowledge, responsibility, and silence. How such a system had been created and maintained became a central issue for survivors. Memory became both a burden and a duty. Many felt compelled to speak despite trauma. Others remained silent for years. Testimony took many forms. Auschwitz ceased to be only a physical location. It became a symbol of industrialized murder. Its name represented the extreme outcome of hatred, dehumanization, and state power. The camp complex itself remained largely intact. Barracks, fences, and ruins stood as witnesses. Unlike many other sites, Auschwitz was not erased. Its preservation allowed future generations to confront its reality. The liberation of Auschwitz did not bring immediate justice. Trials would come later. Reconstruction of lives would take decades. Memory would evolve slowly. However, liberation marked the end of the camp's function as a killing center. No further transports arrived. No further selections occurred. The machinery of death was finally halted. The survivors who remained carried knowledge that could not be destroyed. Their presence contradicted attempts to erase evidence. Their voices ensured that the crimes would not remain hidden. The discovery of Auschwitz confronted the world with undeniable proof. Mass murder had occurred on an industrial scale. Human beings had been reduced to numbers, labor units, and ashes. This reality could no longer be denied. Chapter 9 marks the moment when Auschwitz shifted from a place of secrecy to a place of exposure. What had been concealed behind fences and lies was now visible. The camp entered history not as a rumor, but as documented fact. The consequences of this discovery would shape legal, moral, and historical understanding for generations. Auschwitz became a reference point for the limits of human cruelty and the necessity of remembrance. The story of Auschwitz did not end with liberation. Its legacy would continue through trials, memorials, education, and testimony. The final chapter would address these consequences and the enduring impact of what was revealed. The liberation of Auschwitz did not mark the end of its history. It marked the beginning of a long process of confrontation, responsibility, and remembrance. What had been uncovered in January of the year 1945 demanded explanation, documentation, and judgment. The crimes committed at Auschwitz could not be absorbed into the general destruction of the war. They required specific acknowledgement and response. In the months following liberation, the camp complex became a site of investigation. Soviet authorities secured the area and continued documenting evidence. Survivors were interviewed repeatedly. Their testimonies were recorded in detail. Structures were examined. Belongings were cataloged. International awareness grew gradually. Photographs taken at Auschwitz were published. Journalists reported on what had been found. Eyewitness accounts reached audiences across Europe and beyond. The name Auschwitz became associated with systematic mass murder. As the war ended in May of the year 1945, attention turned toward accountability. Responsibility for crimes committed at Auschwitz extended across many levels. It included political leadership, military command, administrative offices, industrial partners, and individual perpetrators. The camp system had functioned through coordinated cooperation. The first major effort to address responsibility came through international military tribunals. In the city of Nuremberg, leading figures of the Nazi regime were put on trial. The trials focused on crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Evidence from concentration camps, including Auschwitz, played a central role. Documents recovered from Auschwitz and other camps were presented in court. Survivor testimony described deportations, selections, forced labor, medical experiments, and killings. Photographs and films showed the physical reality of the camps. The scale of the crimes could not be denied. In addition to the international trials, national courts pursued perpetrators associated directly with Auschwitz. Former camp commandants, guards, doctors, and administrators were arrested and prosecuted. Some were tried in Poland. Others were tried in Germany or other countries. Rudolf Höss, the former commandant of Auschwitz, was captured after the war. He provided detailed testimony about the operation of the camp. His statements confirmed survivor accounts and documentary evidence. Holst was tried in Poland and executed in the year 1947. Other perpetrators faced different outcomes. Some were convicted and imprisoned. Some received reduced sentences. Others escaped prosecution entirely and lived for decades without facing trial. Justice was uneven and often incomplete. The process of accountability extended beyond legal proceedings. Societies were forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How had such a system been created? Who had supported it? Who had benefited from it? Who had remained silent? For survivors, the end of the war did not bring immediate relief. Many had lost entire families. Homes had been destroyed or confiscated. Communities no longer existed. Survivors faced displacement, illness, and trauma. Physical recovery was slow and uncertain. Years of starvation and abuse left lasting damage. Psychological trauma affected memory, relationships, and identity. Many survivors struggled to speak about their experiences. Some chose silence for years or decades. Others felt compelled to testify publicly. Survivor accounts took the form of memoirs, interviews, court testimony, and educational work. Each testimony represented both personal pain and historical record. Children who survived Auschwitz faced particular challenges. Many had no surviving relatives. Some were too young to remember life before the camp. Their post-war lives were shaped by loss and displacement. As time passed, Auschwitz became a place of memory. In the late 1940s, the site was preserved rather than demolished. Barracks, fences, watchtowers, and ruins remained. The camp was transformed into a memorial and museum. Preservation served a specific purpose. Auschwitz was not to be abstracted or mythologized. It was to remain visible and tangible. Visitors could see the physical reality of the camp system. Exhibits displayed personal belongings recovered from the camp. Shoes, suitcases, eyeglasses, and clothing were shown. Each item represented an individual life. The scale of the displays conveyed the magnitude of loss. The memorial became a place of education. Students, researchers, and visitors from around the world came to learn. Guided tours presented historical context. Survivor testimonies were incorporated into educational programs. Auschwitz also became a focal point in discussions of genocide, human rights, and international law. The crimes committed there influenced the development of legal definitions. The concept of genocide was formalized. International conventions were adopted to prevent similar crimes. Medical crimes committed at Auschwitz influenced post-war medical ethics. New standards emphasized informed consent and the protection of human subjects. These principles were shaped directly by the abuses revealed in the camps. Despite these developments, memory remained contested. In the decades after the war, some attempted to deny or minimize what had occurred. Others distorted facts for political purposes. Survivor testimony and historical research became essential in countering denial. As generations passed, the number of living survivors decreased. The responsibility of remembrance shifted increasingly to historians, educators, and institutions. Preserving accurate history became more urgent. Auschwitz stands as a warning. It demonstrates how ordinary administrative systems can be transformed into instruments of mass murder. It shows how ideology, bureaucracy, and technology can combine to eliminate moral restraint. The camp also reveals the consequences of dehumanization. Victims were reduced to categories and numbers. Once humanity was denied, violence became routine. Auschwitz illustrates the final outcome of such processes. Responsibility for Auschwitz does not belong solely to those who operated the camp. It extends to systems that enabled it. It includes indifference, compliance, and silence. Understanding this responsibility is essential to preventing repetition. The legacy of Auschwitz is not confined to the past. Its lessons remain relevant wherever hatred, exclusion, and authoritarian control appear. Remembering Auschwitz is not an act of mourning alone. It is an act of vigilance. For survivors, memory was often painful but necessary. For the world, memory became a duty. The preservation of Auschwitz ensures that evidence remains visible. It resists attempts to erase or distort history. The story of Auschwitz does not end with liberation or trials. It continues through education, commemoration, and moral reflection. Each generation encounters this history anew. Auschwitz represents both the depths of human cruelty and an obligation to confront it honestly. It challenges assumptions about progress and civilization. It demands attention to the conditions that make such crimes possible. The final responsibility lies with those who remember. To remember accurately, to remember fully, to remember without distortion, Auschwitz remains a place where history speaks directly. Its ruins and testimonies form a record that cannot be undone. They stand as evidence of what occurred when humanity was systematically denied. This concludes the history of Auschwitz as a camp. Its legacy continues beyond its fences. It endures as a warning, a record, and a responsibility that cannot be abandoned.